When Louisiana had 2 hurricane landfalls in less than 24 hours. How storm surge made the Mississippi River flow backwards. Why weakening hurricanes can still bring major flooding. And how a levee protected New Orleans from catastrophic storm surge. This is NTWC.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to NTWC Live. It is August the 23rd, Wednesday. Glad to have you all along today. We've got a lot to talk about today. Ben Schott, Chris Franklin are here. Of course, Bill Reed, Dr. Hal Needham are with us as well. We'll get to everybody in just a moment. We're going to talk about the anniversary of Hurricane Isaac and then wherever else our minds take us today. So I think it'll be an interesting program for you today. Before we get to that, though, I need to thank our sponsors who make this event a possibility each and every week. First and foremost, USAA. USAA has been a sponsor, for as long as we've been doing the National Tropical Weather Conference, NTWC Live, other things the Storm Science Network has been doing for years, student activities, things like that. USAA has been a sponsor, and we sincerely appreciate the support of USAA for all they do for us and around the nation. Also, the South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau. South Padre Island is the home to the National Tropical Weather Conference. We'll be back there live in April once again. We hope you'll join us live and in person. But if you can't, we're always here every Wednesday morning during the hurricane season for NTWC Live. But thanks to the South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau. Also thanks to the Weather Company and to Weatherboy, a couple of organizations that have joined in and really made the conference even more special than what it is. So we appreciate that. Host for the program, Bill Reed, Dr. Hal Needham. You know, there's 4 of us that put this program together. I'm in deep South Texas near South Padre Island. Bill's near Houston. Hal's in Galveston. Alex is in San Antonio. A tropical storm just hit Texas and didn't affect any of us, for the most part. So let's get to Bill first. And, Bill, I had at the TV station in Weslaco, deep South Texas, we had 0.4 of an inch of rain from a landfalling tropical storm. What did you have at your place?
Oh, well, first, good morning, everybody. But the outermost rain band that came in managed to line up right over League City, and it leaked 0.72 of an inch of rain into my gauge, which was the first measurable since early July. So most people here didn't get anything at all, and the drought persists. We'll talk a little bit after we start off with our guests. We'll talk a little bit about what we had with Harold the Helpful, I think we'll call it. Nobody died in it, and storms are going on. But first off, I'll introduce one of our guests, and then Hal will introduce the other one. It's my pleasure to introduce Ben Schott. Ben is the meteorologist in charge at the National Weather Service Forecast Office for the New Orleans, Baton Rouge area down in Slidell. He, like me, he was a forecaster in the Navy, and then after the Navy, he went back to school, got an atmospheric science degree at the University of Washington. In the Weather Service, he has been moved around quite a bit. He's had offices in Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Montana, New York, and Wisconsin before coming down to New Orleans. He came by his management training naturally with 2 other meteorologists in charge jobs at Binghamton, New York, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Hal, would you like to introduce Chris?
I would love to, Chris. So excited to have you on NTWC Live this morning. Chris Franklin is the chief meteorologist at WWL-TV in New Orleans. Chris has covered some major weather events, including Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, and Isaac, and most recently, the active hurricane seasons of 2020 and 2021, including Hurricane Ida. Chris has been featured on the Weather Channel and Fox News Channel and has 2 decades of experience. Chris, welcome to NTWC Live.
Thank you all so much. And I'm hoping the rest of this season stays quiet for us in Southeast Louisiana. As you said, we've had some busy seasons in recent times, and hopefully we'll get through this one a little quieter too.
Chris, it's funny. I would go to like Florida and places like that, and everyone would be talking about South Louisiana. You know it's bad when you go to other places, and they've been talking about the recent hurricane seasons. Just the hyperactivity y'all have experienced there for a long time.
It's been busy, and it's time we deserved a break. So we're hoping for another couple of quiet seasons. And as far as home insurers go, we're also hoping for a quiet season, so more of these insurance companies will come back into the state and start helping us out with some homeowners insurance here.
Well, we got all these memorable storms that have hit your area, but we thought it'd be useful to talk about one that probably most people outside of your immediate area around New Orleans have forgotten about, but it was a very eventful and important lessons learned storm. So, Ben, why don't you start us off with a overview of what happened with Isaac?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to do that. Let me show just a couple, real quick presentation of just a couple of little interesting points that I have from the event itself. As I went back through and started to research, Isaac and its impacts and some of the lessons learned, I came up with like 4 or 5 things that I think are, at least from I found from kind of a scientific point, were kind of interesting with the storm itself. I'm going to show a couple of cone graphics. It's something that the Hurricane Center puts out. Everybody's very familiar with them, but it kind of gives some interesting context to some things that were going on with Isaac well before it made landfall anywhere on the Gulf Coast. And so the graphic that you're seeing right now is from Thursday the 23rd. Here we are 5-6 days before possible landfall. And you see coming in somewhere between Mobile, Pascagoula, if you were go use the center line. I know we tell people never use the center line, but if you use the center line, that's where it's going. And so at this point, a lot of the models still had it going more so in the north central portion of the Gulf. If I jump just a little bit later, like 2 days later on Saturday of that week, the track and almost all the models had shifted and had it going into the Panhandle. And so I use this example of don't let model consensus overwhelm you every single time. There were things going on here, and I'll talk about it briefly, but this switcheroo that happened with the models put this area even at more risk, because I think at this point, and I'm talking with forecasters who had been here, there was a lot of concern that because we were outside the cone, public perception is the threat was over for us. You jump just 24 hours later, now, the ridge is moving in just the right spot. It's starting to push things further to the west. And okay, well, now we have us, centered somewhere around maybe Gulfport, Biloxi. And then you jump a little bit later, 24 hours later or less, and now the landfall is going to be somewhere west of the Mississippi. So the quick version of this as a lesson learned is model consensus is nice. It is something that we as meteorologists, use as a way to give us support that something's going to happen, and it's going to happen the way that we think it is. But understand that sometimes, the models just aren't right. And the interesting thing here was that there was all sorts of hints, possibly with a slight adjustment in the upper level pattern, which happened, it pushed it hundreds of miles further to the west. So there's a second part of this that I throw in there. Just as kind of a moving forward thing. But I also want to throw in just, small chances, but huge impacts. What I mean by that is if you look at this graphic, this was the wind probability of at least 58 miles per hour. Southwest Louisiana is in that 5 to 10 plus range. You look at that and people want to discount it. And so lesson learned is small chances, but big impacts. Do not let that small chance mean it can't happen here, especially for something as impactful as this, as we know what it turned out to be. Another lesson learned there. Moving through rain bands. The heavy rain bands were amazing with Isaac. And because of some other things I'll talk about next, they became quite devastating. You can see there's over 20 inches of rainfall in New Orleans. Interesting thing with that is you would think that created an amazing amount of flooding in the city. It wasn't as bad as it could have been. A lot of the heaviest rain band, believe it or not, if you were to look at it in a very zoomed in scale, and I've worked with the River Forecast Center, which is right next door to our building here in our building, and a lot of it almost fell right actually Mississippi itself, the river. So there was still flooding in the city, but it could have been a much more horrific for folks in the city if it was set up just a little bit differently. But again, some of the flooding from this storm was amazing. And that's the next thing that I want to kind of hit. But beforehand, I guess I switched up my slides. I apologize. This is one of the first times we saw the Mississippi River flow backwards. The surge was so intense and strong that this is the gauge that you see here. This is Belle Chase, which is right outside the city of New Orleans, just on the just south of the city for the most part, on the Mississippi River. And for 24 hours, the river flew backwards. It went up as far as Baton Rouge. It pushed surge that far north. So this is one of the really interesting things that come from this storm when we start to realize the power of water. A lot of times some people still discount the surge and the power of water, but this is another understanding. You think how strong this was, and this wasn't a Cat 4, Cat 5, but this still pushed the Mississippi backwards all the way to Baton Rouge. This kind of ties into the small chances but big impact thing, and it was one of my things that I found very interesting as well. And this may have been the first sign of a new trend. There's been lots of studies recently about the slowing of storms as they approach the Gulf Coast. But that's exactly what Isaac did, and that's why it helped the rainfall amounts be so tremendous. So you see the radar on the side, but if you look at the track on the left-hand side, you see the dots get really packed together, really close as it approached the Louisiana coastline. And so with that little bit of increase in intensity and the slowing down, I think that also helped the surge that I just talked about really push up. But it also, that slowing down, really increased the rainfall amounts. And we saw that with recently with Sally. We saw it with Ida. It may have been a contributing factor with Harvey. I won't go exactly there for that one. But some of these other events, we've seen this exact same thing happen. And it's been something that's been put in some research documentation over the last couple of years. So these are some of the more interesting things that I saw from Isaac. The one last item that's not on here is the date. For whatever reason, August 29th is the most cursed day in all of Southeast Louisiana, most likely. Katrina, Isaac, and also just recently Ida, which is a very interesting coincidence, but all on the same day. So those are some of the key takeaways, most kind of interesting things that I saw without digging into some of the other impacts, which I'm sure we'll discuss.
That's interesting. I've been involved in a lot of conversations on the slowing at landfall. It's very tough here in the Western Gulf to quantify it, since our average landfall speed is generally around 10 miles an hour. So a 10% slowing down, 9 miles an hour. The one common thing I've seen, though, and it looked like the same thing was happening with Isaac, is that coming across the Caribbean and most of the Eastern Gulf, it's well entrenched in the deep east to west flow under the subtropical high, and the time it starts to recurve, it's coming out of that flow. So it's actually losing the steering current. Actually, the same sort of things happened with Franklin down in the Caribbean the last couple of days. So the key to forecasting that is to capture the timing of when it loses the strong steering flow. And Harvey, actually, the steering flow went to zero. It was trapped in between the two highs at that point. So that happens fairly. Most of your record rains that you'll find in tropical systems in Louisiana and Texas are that pattern. So that's interesting. And I had forgotten that Isaac had done that. And a very good point about because of the location at all, even though it was not a quote major hurricane, that extended period of forcing from the wind made the storm surge that much worse.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting about, if you look at the geography of Southeast Louisiana, is you have these tidal lakes, right? And so you're pushing all that water from east to west into Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Maurepas. And there's a town called Laplace that there's no levee system. There's two major interstates that are right there. And that town gets crushed in these events, especially when you get a storm like Isaac here or Ida recently, where you have extended easterly flow. So much water gets pushed in there on top of the rainfall. And if you look, that's where a lot of the flooding and some of the flooding deaths occurred, just because it becomes just impossible for when you throw on the rain on top of the surge water that's coming in there. It becomes amazingly devastating for that area.
Are there any, do you know of any plans to mitigate the issue around Laplace?
They are starting to talk of that. The Army Corps of Engineers, I think, have started some studies, and they're looking at trying to find ways to end that. There's some backwater channels where things have kind of worked around some of the things that they've done, and they're looking to solidify that area to add some protection, because that area was like during Ida also received almost 15 inches of rain and had flooding, people on rooftops. It recalled a lot of really bad memories for the area. Luckily, no one, I believe, died directly in that flooding, but it was a pretty scary situation overnight when that really took hold, even during Ida. So I know it's an area that desperately needs that type of protection.
Yeah. Chris, were you here for Isaac, or was that before your time?
No, I've been here since I've been back home in New Orleans since 2005. So I've done them all since Katrina. So yeah, Isaac, it was something when we were discussing bringing up this storm and looking back at its history and impact. There's always one or two key features I seem to remember from each of the storms that have impacted Southeast Louisiana. And for Isaac, the one thing that sticks out in my mind, and Ben just really explained that perfectly, is the flooding in Laplace and what we consider our river parishes. It's as you go west from New Orleans Metro, Orleans Parish, Jefferson Parish, along Lake Pontchartrain, then you get to St. Charles, St. John, St. James. And as that water flows into Lake Pontchartrain from the east, it comes up against the levees. The hurricane risk reduction system is what it's termed in Orleans Parish. Can't go there. It gets to Jefferson. We have a levee system here. Can't go there. And it's able to move right into our river parishes. And as I posted this discussion on Facebook and social media to get folks to watch, and just also asked, what were your memories and what were the impacts to you? Just about everyone that reached out to me said it was the flooding in Laplace. And that is what I think most people remember from this storm. Also considering that, after Katrina, after Gustav in 2008, you had a lot of folks that had flooded and heavily damaged from Katrina. They happened to move to some of these communities, which then flooded from what a talk that Ken Graham did at the conference last summer. This was just one, but I thought Ben's impacts perfectly gave the perfect example of why no storm is just when you break down all of the impacts. But as far as all those impacts go, I think what was probably most remembered from this storm was that lake flooding in Laplace and in the river parishes.
Yeah, that I'd forgotten about the damming effect of the levees that protect the Mississippi River side of the problem in there. It's very complex. Was there a fair amount of warning for the folks in Laplace? Because all I remember seeing is people said that they had no idea this was coming at them, but we hear that from citizens in almost every event. So I don't get too upset when I hear that. I'd like to hear more.
Right. And I think when the Hurricane Center started issuing the storm surge graphics, and we were showing those on air, we're certainly showing the estimates in height of what the lake water will get. And we'll kind of break down the lake even more so than just a set number of 2 to 4 feet for all of Lake Pontchartrain. We'll kind of break it down based on the shoreline of the areas that we know will be inundated with water. I think it's one of those. It's one thing to say it. It's another to actually see it happening. And I think the folks in Laplace, you hear some of those worst case scenarios, and you hope that it won't be that bad. But then, as Ben said, as we go through the night into the next day, all of a sudden you see just how bad it was in the Laplace area. And we had water on I-10, a major, not that this was an evacuation type storm, but you have a major artery in and out of New Orleans, and it took on water. So the flooding, as far as the residential concern, obviously is very important, but also the fact that you're cutting off a major artery into Metro New Orleans with these type of events, and it, for lack of a better term, for just a one, you had this major route cut off for a time.
Yeah, and given the impacts that it had there, it seems like there should be evacuation of a place like Laplace for any storm because of the lead time you have to give them to get out of there before the roads become impassable.
And it doesn't take much of an east wind to start piling up the water into Lake Pontchartrain. Even if we just have a sustained southeast east wind, non-tropical, you'll start getting those water levels increasing. My in-laws live in Venetian Isles, which is in eastern Orleans Parish. That's outside of the hurricane risk reduction system. A stiff east wind, and they are already talking about the water in the bayous behind the house coming up, and then water coming onto the streets. Obviously not impassable, but it does not take much of a strong wind to suddenly inundate southern Louisiana or metro New Orleans, parts of the metropolitan area.
Wow. Hal, you're staring intently at the screen.
Yeah. Well, Chris and Ben, I mean, you're talking about you get a persistent east wind, anything tropical that's centered south of you, you're going to get an east wind in Lake Pontchartrain. It's well documented that the lake water will respond to that very quickly. A lot of people were surprised in Laplace with Ida. I was actually in Laplace for Ida. A lot of people were shocked. They even said, we're in FEMA's X zone. We're not even in the flood zone. How are we flooding? We know they flooded in Ida. We know they flooded in Isaac. Question I have for you, the U.S. Army Corps map shows a 13-foot surge during Betsy in 65 and also the 1915 hurricane right around Frenier there, very close to Laplace. Do you feel like people have that memory of, Betsy also would have flooded that area really bad in the mid-60s? Does that memory kind of exist in a local conversation, or do you feel like that's back too far in time and a lot of people are not aware of that?
I'll let Chris answer that with him having more of a local take. Yeah.
The references to Betsy, I think that was the last storm before Katrina that residents here referenced. Growing up and, a weather nerd as I was, that was always the storm hallmark for Southeast Louisiana. And now this generation is Katrina. And you think we are starting to become almost a little removed from the impacts of Katrina. And I know I'll go do school talks and I'll talk to some of the kids, and they haven't been born yet. So we're approaching now 20 years post Katrina. But for Isaac and then Gustav just a few years before, I think that was still very much on people's minds. I don't know if it's just a mentality of New Orleanians and Southern Louisianans that we are a resilient people. We've gone through so much that even after a few years removed, we still think it's not going to happen again. It can't happen again. That was a once in a generation type storm, so it shouldn't happen again. But it is surprising to hear of the Laplace area being in an X flood zone, knowing that it doesn't take much to see that water from Lake Pontchartrain surge into some of those river communities. So that is surprising to me. But for the some folks that will say we didn't know, as Bill was mentioning, or we weren't prepared for it. These are fairly well forecasted events, and when we know a storm like an Isaac is going to take a path that it did, we know almost certainly, without really diving into the potential impacts, almost, number one on the list of potential impacts is going to be Laplace will flood. You get a strong east wind from a storm at that path, Laplace will flood. And unfortunately, that is still going to be an issue until the Corps is able to figure out some way to mitigate this.
Before we go over to Ben, Chris, a quick follow-up with that. You're talking a lot about Lake Pontchartrain, Laplace. When a storm comes towards the coast, people inherently want to really fixate on landfall points. So we're looking at like Ida, landfall point down by Grand Isle. How do you forecast and communicate that to get people aware of the landfall point, but also aware that in Southeast Louisiana, you can have a very broad geography that's affected in different ways at different timing as well, right?
We do a parish by parish breakdown, county by county as well. We do cover 3 counties in Mississippi for broadcasting. And we break it down parish by parish. We'll spend 10, 15 minutes in one weather segment while we're doing our coverage to break it down of all the potential impacts with storm surge, winds, rainfall amounts. We try and break it down because we do have a very varied geography in Southeast Louisiana, Southern Mississippi. and not everyone will be impacted exactly the same. We've seen that time and time again from each storm, that in some communities, the surge is going to be the greater threat. In others, it's going to be the wind, depending upon the path of the storm. And in others, it may just be the rainfall, figuring out where one of those bands will set up, sometimes a near impossible task. But we will break it down and try and get viewers to see the bigger picture, as opposed to just that center line, that point. You know, I like the center line for the simplicity of seeing slight adjustments in the track forecast. I show it, but I also explain to viewers, don't pay precise attention to that line. I like to use it for more as myself for a guide of seeing if there is a trend in the models, and maybe the Hurricane Center is picking up on a trend. That's what I like using it for, as opposed to just focus on this individual point. And we do stress that within the cone, even outside of that cone, there is the possibility of the storm, meandering one way or the other, even outside of that cone. That is a third of the time that happens, and the impacts obviously will be far outside of that cone. So that's usually when we'll show the potential tropical storm and hurricane wind field graphic on top of the cone to try and explain every possible impact and effect that you will see from the storm.
Sounds like you got your work cut out for you when anything's approaching.
Each and every storm. That's why when they'll ask me, how much time do you need? I said, well, how much time do you have? Because I'll take it all.
Mm-hmm.
That's good stuff, guys. Let's take a sponsor break real quick, and we'll be back to more questions with you two guys. We've got a couple of questions coming in from online. We'll do that after our sponsor break. But let's take a moment to thank USAA, the big sponsor of our program from the beginning. South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau will be live in South Padre Island once again in April at the Marriott Courtyard Hotel, right on the beach. I hope you'll join us there once again. The weather company, they make all the graphics that a lot of TV meteorologists show on the air, and a lot of other things as well. We appreciate what they do for NTWC. And Weather Boy, the last couple of years has been doing scholarships, a contest basically, to bring in college students to the National Tropical Weather Conference. We've had 3 college students brought in, all expenses paid, courtesy of Weather Boy, to the last 2 NTWCs, so that they could learn from the experts and spend time with the experts in the field. Each of them get to pick one of the speakers and sit down and have a one-on-one with them, and that's all courtesy of Weather Boy. So thanks to Weather Boy for being a big part of what we're doing. We appreciate that sincerely. We'll get back to the questions and answers in just a second. Before we do that, though, let's get a tropical update. Bill, we've since we last met, we've had stuff to talk about in Texas, but it kind of threaded the needle between you and Hal and me and Alex.
Yeah, perfect field goal, wasn't it? Hey, I think we got a selling point for our conference in April. They can wrap a little vacation around that and go see the eclipse. It's the Tuesday after the conference.
Exactly, it's the Monday after. So,
see, I told you my ADD would kick in.
Yeah, it's the timing is perfect on that. You leave here, fly, just go up to Central Texas or the Hill Country, watch the eclipse, and see the remnants of the after effects of Harold.
Yeah, just a quick satellite overview and then a few details on there. I could spend all day, as Chris pointed out, talking about the weather that's going on. Starting with the remnants of Harold, it's all the rain's way out ahead of where the center is now. The wind shear is taking care of that, and it's acting like they normally do when they move north. And it's providing some nice rain, probably on my property up in New Mexico today. Down south of there in the Eastern Pacific, the next wave in the disturbance in the train that's been coming off Central America is totally disorganized now. But by this weekend, NAC is pretty confident we'll see some development south of the coast of Mexico. Franklin actually looks more like a tropical storm today than it has in either of the last 2 days, and it's parked over Hispaniola. We'll talk some more about that. This little blob here is what used to be Gert. You notice they're not talking about it at all, and nothing is showing it redeveloping in there. So, but it doesn't want to go away. It just sits there spinning away with one big thunderstorm. This was formerly Emily. It's got a chance to develop as it's pulled into the westerlies before going extratropical and merging with a jet stream there. And the disturbance that they were a little frisky on both the models and NHC yesterday. They're not quite as frisky on today, coming off Africa. There's nothing really obvious right behind that. So let's see what we got going here. There's the outlook area for south of Mexico. This one may become a threat to a little farther south in Mexico, the way the weather pattern's shaping up, but until it forms, that's just speculation. And here's our war zone in the tropical Atlantic. Again, we're only going now with a 30% chance on the wave behind what was Emily. Short period for Emily in the next few days to be a storm. And then we'll talk about Harold now, which is down to a remnant low as of while we've been talking. And let's see, where do I have it here? Satellite imagery. Good luck finding the remnant low. It's starting to get a little bit of hint in the visible, but anyway, the convective bands are still coming in around Corpus Christi, and Tim and Alex, you still may get a shot of rain out of the leftover moisture train coming in behind Harold. The moisture will be in New Mexico today, Colorado tonight and tomorrow, and who knows, maybe it'll come all the way around and give Ben and Chris some rain in about a week or so. I don't know. This was the area of risk of flash flooding. It doesn't take as much rain to get flash flooding, so 1 to 3 inch rain in an hour or so in the dry arroyos and rocky soil out there can create dangerous flash floods. Here is the, well, I was hoping to get, come on, spit it off. Huh. There we go. Here's a 2-day total of the rainfall showing the track of the center went in on the north side of Padre Island, came across the King Ranch just south of Kingsville, and the heaviest rain, as you might expect, was in the northeast or eastern semicircle of the storm as it moved steadily inland along the Rio Grande, and a few pockets in there. It looks like 8 to 10 inches of rain may have fallen. So it was, for the speed it was moving, that's kind of an overachiever. It's a pretty good rainmaker on that. The storm surge forecast was for 1 to 3 foot tide rises on much of the Texas coast. It seems like it verified quite well. The automated gauges, the highest reading I got was up the Nueces River out of Corpus Christi Bay, where it came close to being a 3 foot above astronomical tide in there. Moving on to Franklin. Franklin is currently hammering Hispaniola. We're getting I don't have radar coverage down there, and I won't have rainfall information in real time in all likelihood in there, but the forecast is for easily over a foot of rain as it slowly moves across the mountainous terrain of the Dominican Republic and maybe portions of Haiti over the next day or so. Update this. As you see, it's centered over Hispaniola this morning and is only slowly moving out into the southwest Atlantic tomorrow and Friday without doing much. I figure it'll be disrupted quite a bit as it goes over the mountains, and the more favorable environment for it to develop and picks up over the weekend. And a hurricane is forecast to once again shoot through the goalposts between Bermuda and the East Coast, but I wouldn't get too frisky with that forecast because there's a lot of uncertainty. And in fact, the ensemble models, this is off the, this morning, this is off the European, is very bullish on Franklin becoming probably a major hurricane first of the year. And you can't find Bermuda under all those lines. Formerly known as Emily is shown in those members there. The current disturbance, not a whole lot of interest in that, and then another one comes off towards the end of the 10-day period. Probably of more interest to us in the U.S. is that for several days now, the ensemble models, the European, have shown development coming off of Central America into the Gulf of Mexico. And today it has this interesting split with the big high retrograding a little bit over the continental U.S. It'll open up a southerly stream, and one chunk of members that takes the system up across Florida and the East Coast, while another one has it kind of hammered and trapped down here in the Bay of Campeche. The GFS is not so excited about it, but it's actually the same basic forecaster. It's just a different way the ensembles show out up there, but it is the same thing to look at. Very busy. It's supposed to be busy. We're in the peak of the hurricane season.
Thank you, Bill. Great stuff. A lot more to talk about than we've had for the last 3 months. So thanks for that update. We appreciate it, and anxious to see where these things go. At least we know what happened with Harold. I just checked Amistad Reservoir where it rained over Del Rio. It's up about 6 inches just from the immediate rain. So let's see where it goes from there. All right, GeoTrek update time. Hal, take it away, and then we'll come back and get the questions going again.
Bill, thanks so much for the tropical weather update. Wow, it seems like a lot's going on in the basin right now. Well, y'all, GeoTrek update. GeoTrek travels the world looking for and reporting on stories related to extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. So this is a time of the year where we like to get out there and document extreme weather. Like a lot of you, I know a lot of weather experts and enthusiasts are going to be out there storm chasing over the next couple weeks and months. And today on the GeoTrek update, we're just going to talk a little bit about perspectives on storm chasing. So meteorology, extreme weather, it's all very exciting. We learn a lot, we discover a lot. But that said, we have to be careful when we're in these disaster zones. Keep in mind that a storm that may be exciting for you to cover could be very catastrophic and have huge life-changing implications for people on the ground. So we really want to find that balance between documenting the weather, but also connecting and if possible, being a blessing on those in the path of the storm. I wanted to point you to a couple GeoTrek podcasts that we've recorded over the past several years that really touch on this topic. And the first two I'm going to share about were GeoTrek podcast episodes 42 and 43 that we recorded with Chris Franklin, one of our guests today on NTWC Live. These are called Remembering Hurricane Katrina with Chris Franklin. We did a 2-part series last August. And Chris, I thought you did such a good job. You were talking about what it was like to be a young meteorologist, really fresh out of school, covering a storm like Katrina. There's some level of excitement with it, but you quickly picked up this was going to have a huge impact on really a region where you were originally from. I thought you did a really good job of walking us through how to document and forecast meteorology, but also be aware of the human impacts and be sensitive to that. I thought you really did a good job on those podcasts we did, kind of helping people get a sense of how we can do really both of those things with an awareness of the impacts of people that are in harm's way. Some other podcasts as well I wanted to point you to, episode 49 last year, Voices from the Hurricane Ian Disaster Zone. These were recordings right from the ground of Hurricane Ian last year. And also podcast number 4 with Melissa Moon called Insights from a Tornado Chasing Mom. So all of these really get into this fine line with storm chasing on getting out there, learning about meteorology, documenting it, but also being aware of people in harm's way. And lastly, something I wanted to say, we have to be careful about how we behave, not only on the ground, but also on social media. So be careful that, you'll see posts of people saying, wow, hopefully this thing will get itself together or this thing will intensify. Be careful when we use language like that, because what's exciting meteorologically could be a big impact to someone in harm's way there. I think about an interview that I did in the past right after Hurricane Michael in 2018, and I was talking to some folks there that just survived a Category 5 hurricane hit there in Mexico Beach, Florida. And from talking to them, I asked them, do you mind talking about this? For those people, they actually found it therapeutic to talk and to do an interview. And then I'll find other people that really you quickly pick up, they just want privacy. They're just processing maybe a loss of material items or a human loss. So I think there's really no rules in these disaster zones. It's just really important to be sensitive to those around us, be aware of where they're at. And sometimes you just turn the camera off and you're just a shoulder for someone to cry on, and you're just a listening ear for an hour or two for someone that just went through something difficult. So anyway, I just wanted to point you all to those podcasts we've done in the past. It's definitely the heart of hurricane season. A lot of us will be out there over the next couple weeks and months, but I think those podcasts can really help give us guidance and perspectives on storm chasing. Again, Chris, it was really interesting to hear about you talk about the impacts of Katrina right there in New Orleans, where you're from. And I thought I learned a lot from you when we were doing those podcasts last year. Anyway, that's an update from GeoTrek. Back to you guys.
Thanks, Hal. We appreciate that. Great stuff. And Hal, I love the GeoTrek podcast. You asked the questions the rest of us wish we would have thought of. And that's what makes it so good. And the inquisitiveness and just all the conversations go in places I wish the rest of us could think of. So thank you for taking us there. We appreciate that. GeoTrek podcast. Always good stuff. And, you mentioned, the storm chasers coming to town, and you get excited about them coming to town. But that does, Mark Sudduth was here 2 days ago and left. And as much as I like Mark, I was glad to see him go somewhere else. And the same with Mike from Mike's weather page was here and went somewhere else. And we're always glad to see them leave. And you're right. We talk often about how we talk about, hey, this storm looks really good, which is it may not be the way to present it, because really good to us is really bad. It's a really good looking storm, which means it's a bad storm probably. And because if it looks good meteorologically, it's probably a bad storm. So, okay, let me get to a couple of the comments and questions online. Then we'll get back to Hal and Bill jumping in there. Steve made the comment, Chris, after you were showing the waving of the track with the storm early on. He said that in the 12 years since, the Hurricane Center has reduced the cone size. We know that. With improvements, but also not making those drastic shifts in the cone, making those shifts more subtle. And I think, Chris, you can address that, because there was a time when those knee-jerk moves were a little bigger than they are now, that windshield wiper effect, and we don't see that as much anymore.
Ben was showing the graphics on the dramatic track, but and maybe he can speak more on the kind of the Weather Service and Hurricane Center's thinking on that.
Yeah, Ben, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of been a staple of the Hurricane Center, right? Is to try to keep some consistency. You don't want to do the windshield wiper and then and have it jumping back and forth, and then maybe people losing attention to what could be a major impact. So, that's and the cone size. It's been amazing. Again, the models are excellent. I know I said watch out for model consensus. I understand that still small probabilities can matter, but the modeling has drastically improved over the course of the last 10, 15 years, even since Isaac. And then on top of that, even the intensity forecasts are getting a little better. They're not improving at the same rate. But that's been a huge benefit. So with the shrinking cones, because of the increasing in the accuracy, it gives people a better sense of, when, we really need to start taking action than maybe when there was still a 400-mile spread at day 5.
Did you guys see anything with this? Because, the timing is everything in these things. And it was Friday that trend was going away from New Orleans. So people, it's a weekend, it's going away from us, so anything to worry about. So they kind of tune out. And then they wake up Monday morning, it's like, oh, crap, it's not going away. It's coming right at us now. And, we see that a lot. People, it's the weekend, it's going somewhere else, we're good. And they wake up Monday morning and say, uh-oh. Did you guys see any of that with this?
I know from the television perspective, from viewers, they absolutely do, and they see a shift. And I think post-Katrina, when the models and the forecast really started to ramp up in their improvement, viewers as well as us on air, we started to get a little bit more confident in those changes. While they may seem sudden, you start at least, for New Orleans, you kind of breathe that sigh of relief. Okay, looks like we're out of it. And for those of us in news, I know when the newsroom sees you in the cone, they're sounding the alarm. Whether or not you think you're really at risk of anything, that doesn't matter. If you're in the cone, the sirens have sounded. And I think that was the feeling in our newsrooms, were that, okay, we've gotten out of it. It's a Friday. We're going into the weekend. Let's relax from this one. And there were still some models, and it was that. Well, wait, hold on a second. Let's not discount it just yet. It's still something we need to watch, and maybe we do start to back off on whatever extended coverage we were giving it. But I was actually looking back at some. I keep fairly detailed calendars of my work days, and we began 12-hour shifts on August 27th. So it was, a few days prior to landfall, and I think that was when we were kind of solidly in the cone that we began our wall-to-wall coverage. I don't know if we were necessarily on the air for 24 hours, but the weather team was certainly doing 12-hour shifts. So while I think a lot of folks kind of breathe that sigh of relief, those of us in the weather office were still saying, well, that's looking good for now. Let's see if that trend continues. And that's something we always really stress is, let's see if this is a trend which continues, not just 1 or 2 model runs. Let's go through a 24, 48-hour period. And at that point in Isaac's position, still in the Caribbean, we still had time to watch for those trends in the models. And I think as we started to see it approaching the Gulf, we knew a little bit more certain that this one was not going to avoid us.
Good answer. Good. That's interesting. And one other question coming in from online, just during Isaac's final approach, did you see any indications or any signs of the Gulf Loop eddy in front of it that was going to have an impact on it? I don't know who wants to jump on that one.
I mean, I don't know. I did not look at that, to be real honest. So I don't have a good feel. I mean, the thing is that as it approached was the kind of the item that I brought up. There's been lots of studies recently of the increasing temperature of the shelf water. So that may have had an impact on why it was able to help continue to increase in intensity as it approached. There was probably other upper level things. Obviously there maybe wasn't as much shear. Some other things helping to exhaust the top of the storm that could help that as well. But the biggest player again was just that idea that it went from 12, 15 knots down to 5 as it approached, and then stuck there for a good 18, 20-hour period. Ended up being the intense rainfall maker as it just kind of stalled out, because it really had 2 landfalls. There was a landfall in Plaquemines Parish. Here we kind of call it down towards the Crowfoot or the Mississippi, where there's 3 passes on the far end there. If you look at it, it kind of has a 3-prong look to it, and it made a landfall there, and then it made another landfall, a little bit over closer towards Terrebonne Parish, I think, or Grand Isle on the 29th. So that was kind of the bigger take, but I didn't get a chance to look to see if the loop had any kind of help there with that intensification in that last 24-hour period.
I want to jump back in, lead this second half hour for us.
Hey guys, you there? Tim, it stopped for a second on my feed. I did. Were you talking to me or to Bill?
I'll say go ahead, Hal. If you get some more questions,
gotcha. For some reason, there was a little blip there on my thing. Hey, y'all, I had a question for y'all. I want to pick your brains because you're there in Southeast Louisiana. So in 2008, I was a brand new grad student at LSU, and we were doing field work in Gustav. We take I-10 towards New Orleans, and all of a sudden, we're stopped by the police at the Gramercy exit, and here comes contraflow out of Metro New Orleans. I was brand new to the Gulf Coast, never saw anything like this before. So a mandatory evac through a lot of New Orleans metro area. Then, more than a decade later, here comes Hurricane Ida. It seemed to me like a similar landfall point down by Grand Isle, but no mandatory evacuation. What's the difference? Why the mandatory evacuation for Gustav and not for Ida? I mean, really 3 things come to mind. I mean, for one, Gustav seemed like a much better developed storm pre-landfall way out in the Gulf. Did it just give more time to have more certainty and do the evacuation? Or when Ida came, did they say, hey, that mandatory evac for Gustav wasn't really necessary, we're not going to do that for a storm like this anymore? Or number 3, were there some influences of COVID as well? Because Ida was kind of in the COVID era where maybe they were concerned about sending people to evacuation centers. Bit of a complex question there. Really concerned, wanting some clarification. Why the mandatory evac for Gustav in 2008 and not for Ida in 2021?
I could probably give you a hint on the Gustav, because I was involved in the conversations from the Hurricane Center with state and local officials there. I think there was an abundance of concern of what had happened in Katrina just 3 years earlier. So they were going to err on the absolute side of caution, because one of the lessons learned is you can wait till it's too late and you put more people in harm's way. So the decisions have to be made long before you're certain on the storm. It was forecast when it came off of Cuba to re-intensify to a Cat 4. So I'm pretty sure that was the driver in Gustav on the evacuation. Now you guys can tell me what happened with Ida, because I wasn't part of it.
Well, I was, so I sorry to preempt Chris, but for Ida, as the roll up to it, I spent most of my time in Baton Rouge, embedded with the emergency management and governor's staff, et cetera. And so a lot of that was going on around me. I probably won't disclose everything just because I don't feel like that would be fair to them. But what I can say is, this is something that we've been talking with the emergency management here in the local area nonstop over the last couple of years. And what that is these quick, fast spin-up storms, like Michael, was one, and Ida, where if you look at a lot of the emergency management plans, and I'm going to try to stay in my lane as a meteorologist, but I work directly with them all the time, so I'm pretty familiar. But if I've said something wrong and someone is in the EM community and want to correct me, I'm 100% okay with that. A lot of the plans were built off of having 120 hours. And the reality over the course of the last 5 to 7 seasons is you may not have that. You may not even have 72 hours from going from a weak tropical storm to a Category 4. And we've seen multiple instances of that in the Gulf in just the last few seasons. So, when it comes to Ida, they didn't have time, because we were talking on a Friday afternoon and went from a 1 now forecasted to be a 4, and you have less than 72 hours to landfall. You have to coordinate, because New Orleans is so close proximity-wise to Mississippi. They're having to coordinate with Mississippi to make sure to help push people out in that direction. So there's a lot of extra coordination that they have to do. It's not as simple as just the city of New Orleans or the state saying, we're just going to do this. And you have to work with the surrounding communities, states, and their folks. So there just wasn't the time, which is an interesting thing. But that's the thing that we've been exercising with our emergency management partners moving forward, is what's going to be the plan B, the plan C, because the 120-hour plan that roughly some people had in their pocket doesn't work anymore.
Chris, any insights?
No, I mean, as Ben said, he more in the lane of emergency management than I am, and what he said is everything that I've heard. The amount of time needed for the inaction of contraflow is so great that we've seen just in the past, and reference a presentation Ken Graham did again last year, is that so many of these storms, all of the historic major landfalling U.S. hurricanes are, for the most part, all tropical storms 3 days prior to landfall. So as you're talking, needing 3+ days to even begin contraflow, there is no way anyone would agree to start enacting contraflow if we had a depression coming off of Cuba, but it's expected to become a major hurricane. I don't think you'd be able to convince any emergency managers that you would have to start contraflow. And I know just in my discussions with some officials from either the city or the state level with emergency management, they've tried either tiered evacuation, where we begin on the coast and some of the more vulnerable areas that are outside of the hurricane risk reduction system, and then begin kind of moving that toward the metro area. Our North Shore parishes and much of Mississippi away from the coast, say north of 10, evacuations aren't necessarily needed for even some of the stronger storms. So I think it's more of the time element. And as Bill said, I think perfectly, with Gustav, we were only 3 years removed from Katrina. I don't think they were taking any word I'm looking for here. They were not going to allow for folks to sit in the path of another major hurricane 3 years removed from Katrina. So I think maybe it was a little bit more of an urgency because of Katrina, whereas Ida, as Ben said, we just didn't have the time that is needed to enact contraflow. I know I just was actually on a roundtable discussion with the mayor, city of New Orleans, emergency manager, and someone from the governor's office, and they've said that the time and logistics of contraflow, it's not as easy as people think. It is not just putting cones up on interstate exits and shutting down certain on and off ramps and then redirecting traffic. It is a logistical nightmare. And the city said it is absolutely a last resort. That would be the last thing that they would do, would be to enact contraflow.
It sounds like both you guys are saying you need a lot of time to do something like contraflow and a mandatory evac. And when you have a fairly high amount of uncertainty, 72, 96 hours out, who's going to make that decision to do something so drastic, right, when there's so much uncertainty in a storm like Ida?
And I don't know. From Ben, it may be that you don't really see contraflow again. I don't know. I'm maybe speaking out of turn and out of my lane here, but it may be that it's so complicated, and unless you have a well-developed storm that's 5 days out and everything is crystal clear in that forecast, which we know never happens, you may never see a contraflow type of an event like we saw in Katrina and in Gustav. Again, it may be more like tiered evacuations where we start initiating that along the coastline. And usually we do that. We'll start the voluntary evacuations for a lot of our barrier islands and some of those outside areas, and then begin more of the mandatory evacuations for all the unprotected areas.
Bill, any thoughts or perspectives?
No, I hate to put something out there without an answer to it, but we somehow need to reinvent what evacuations are, because it's becoming untenable to really get the people that really need to be moved out of harm's way, and not just near the coast, but people that are elderly with medical issues, that being without electricity could be fatal to them. All those other complicating factors take so much time. And we flip-flop on the contraflow. You don't have it, and the storm hits, and a bunch of people are trapped, and then you go through all the trouble to develop the thing. Next storm, you exercise it. It's not such a bad storm. You come back and say, we're never going to do that again. So there's something different we have to do, and it's outside of my feeble brain to figure out what that is.
Hey guys, a quick follow-up question. So the night before Ida, I'm in, New Orleans and points west. And so there's not a mandatory evacuation, but the roads are wide open. Like any one person could get in their vehicle and drive. Like Chris, so when you're not through federal government, you're on the air, you're kind of open. You're not really, I guess, constrained with like what the official orders are or something like that. Will you ever mention like you may want to consider relocating if you're in a certain area? I mean, how do you, I know it's a tightrope you're walking there, because you don't want to make people unnecessarily panic, but at the same time, if things are ramping up, if you have rapid intensification in a storm like Ida, are there times where you say, I know we're not under mandatory evacuation, but you may consider taking action in certain areas? Like, are there ways that you maybe have handled that?
No, absolutely. And I wish I had the graphics. I do have a presentation somewhere on my computer that I did about Ida. And I had a series of graphics that we broke down leaving. And if you should leave, we kind of broke down in an area, where, trying to think of the word here. What are you around? It was one of those, if you're comfortable staying, then stay. If you can live without air conditioning and power for a couple of weeks at least, then you can stay. If you're not around trees, if you're outside of the levee system, obviously you need to leave. But if you feel as though you're in higher ground, you don't need to. But then for those that do, we provided a map of the Southeast and kind of gave the directions of where to go and where not to go. And then I also broke it down to, I can't tell you what to do, but I'll tell you what I'm doing. And what I'm doing is I'm sending my wife and children out of the city. And because of Ida, I felt safe that they were going to Destin, Florida, and they were fine. As a matter of fact, kids, they had a place with a pool, and kids said, no issues at all. But we kind of put a graphic together with some qualifiers of what you would need to meet in order to perhaps stay. And again, a lot of that was just if you're comfortable. If not, this is where you could go and should go. And we kind of outlined the directions of where that would be best.
Coming up on the end of the program, great stuff. Guys, we really appreciate it. Let me finish with this. If we knew then what we know now, what has changed since the storm? Ben, why don't you give it a first shot at that? What's changed since Isaac?
I think the biggest thing is I think the heavy rainfall bans and the flooding. Like we talked about earlier, everyone so focuses on the wind and maybe the surge. But I think it was the biggest awareness around here that you got to understand the heavy rainfall can be just as devastating as any of the other impacts.
Chris?
The modeling has gotten far better from both all the hurricane models, but also the forecasting skill of the Hurricane Center. And we always say, focus on the Hurricane Center's forecast. Everyone now with social media and the internet has access to all of the computer models that we look at, but they are able to look at those models without the knowledge and education in meteorology. So we always tell them to focus on the Hurricane Center's forecast, which outperforms all of the models every single time. And I think more viewers and more of our residents are starting to understand some of these uncertainties, even as the forecasts have improved. I think people still understand there is the inherent uncertainty with forecasting these type of events.
Great stuff. Hal, what did we learn today?
I mean, Southeast Louisiana is so complex, such high impacts. I really enjoyed hearing from both Ben and Chris and just learning from their perspectives today. I think it's just so valuable because it's such a high impact area.
Bill?
Yeah, listening to all this, a sum up that I would have that we've learned since Isaac is we've gotten good enough is probably the word I would use with the science of the forecast and even the science of how to put out a warning. That's not the problem anymore. The problem that we need to be working on is how to solve the vagaries of human nature so that we can get more people to do the right thing.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Ben Schott, Chris Franklin, gentlemen, thank you for spending time with us today. We really appreciate it. Fascinating insight into a system that you guys are right in the middle of, not just one, but several, but in particular Isaac and many that have come before and after that storm. So we appreciate your time. Hope you come back and join us again sometime in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bill, Hal, great job as always. Great questions, great insight from both of you guys. So we appreciate that. Also, we appreciate our sponsors who make this program a possibility. USAA, South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Weather Company, and Weather Boy. Next week, Mark Levitan and David Lawson will be with us. We're going to talk about hurricane resiliency and wind insurance. That's coming up next Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. right here on NTWC Live. Until then, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of NTWC Live Hurricane Center Podcast. If you did, head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. And join us next week. This is NTWC Live.